In this video, I'm going to go over how to develop an outline for your literature review assignment. In terms of where you should be in the process, hopefully you have an in-depth understanding of the key articles that are going to be in your literature review. Remember, you need at least 10 articles. So hopefully you have at least 10 at this point. If you don't, please make sure to meet with me. If you need any assistance, just let me know. And in addition to actually identifying those articles at this point, you have completed that abstraction table, so you've got all of the key information that's summarized in that table. If you've completed your abstraction table and maybe you find that there's an article that doesn't really fit, you can replace that article with another one that is a better fit. You don't need to resubmit your abstraction table to me, but you should make sure that you put all of the same information that you put for the other articles. You should include that for that new article. And if you want to run that by me, that's definitely okay. You should have some idea of what the main thesis and summary statements are going to be based on the articles. So think about what you're going to be writing about. You might change these as you think about the overall message and what it is that you're going to write based on the review of the literature that you've conducted. But you definitely want to have an idea about what your main thesis statement is going to be for your paper. I want you to think about for your thesis statement, thinking about those 10 articles, what is the main question that you're going to answer in your paper? And what are the main concluding points that you're going to make? And what should future research look like? You want to, when you're thinking about your outline at this point, you want to start thinking about how you can organize your 10 papers in some sort of logical way. We're going to talk about some ideas on how to do that, but in the next slide, we'll talk about where to start. So at this point, you found 10 papers at a minimum, and you have to start thinking about how to organize your thoughts and how you might potentially organize an outline of these 10 papers to make sure that they make sense in terms of how you present them in your paper. I think that this is often the hardest part of writing a research paper. Sometimes it's easy to figure out how to organize a paper, but sometimes you might think that your paper is going to go one way and you'll write a paragraph, and then you might have to move it around to see where it fits best. Imagine if you had 10 papers that were controlled experiments by the same research group that progressively built on one another. That would be an ideal setting. However, this isn't typically the case. So it would be great if, we had these 10 papers, they were all the same study design. In terms of experimental studies, they found maybe that walking was beneficial for glucose levels, and then they compared walking to running, and then they compared walking to running to weight training. That would be a really nice logical flow to describe how the research was built upon. However, this is often definitely not what we see in the literature, and when we're finding articles for literature review, there are going to be studies all approaching a similar or same research question, but they're going to come from different perspectives. There's going to be different research groups and people with different study designs conducted in all kinds of different times. So these studies are going to vary quite differently from one another. So since what we often see is kind of this complex set of studies that are different from one another, think about when you're getting started, how you can build an outline of your paper, and think about what each paper brings to the table and where they fit, or the key points that you're going to include in your paper. And you'll want to think about, in terms of those key points, where these papers fall in that outline. You really want to think about the papers you've included in your abstraction table, how they fit together, and how to organize them into key points. So there isn't like a right or wrong way to classify and organize your studies that you've found. Um, but you want to think about what are kind of the key points that support your broader argument. So you could organize by type of study. Maybe there's both observational and experimental studies that you've found. Alternatively, if that doesn't make sense for your research question, you could organize by population. So maybe you separate studies that are done in kids versus those done in adults. Maybe it works best that you organize by certain factors. So for example, I had a student once that wrote a paper and they organized their paper by studies that looked at individual versus interpersonal level factors. So they first talked about individual level factors and then interpersonal level factors that contributed to postpartum depression. Depending on your research question, again, there really isn't a right or wrong way to do this, but if you're looking at specific factors that are related to some given outcome, you might want to separate those factors into one level of factors and another level of factors, but you want to think about how you could tell the story and how you'd want to break up those studies to communicate your main points. I also want to point out that writing is a process and it's often a tedious process. It often takes multiple iterations to get something you're happy with. So I recommend attempting something, putting it down, and then coming back to it. Sometimes people find it helpful to read things out loud and see if it makes sense. Your outline, I want you to think about it as kind of like a table of contents. You've got kind of the main topics and themes that you're going to cover in your literature review. You don't want it to be too detailed, meaning that you're not writing paragraphs at this point. You're just outlining what your paper is going to look like and the main points you're going to include and where those studies are going to go. So it can be bullet points, but I do want you to include the references for the 10 papers you've selected. They need to be included in your outline and kind of the key point from that paper that you're going to make. In terms of the sections of your literature review paper, you're always going to start with an introduction. So remember, this should funnel down. So you kind of start with a broad introduction to your chosen topic, and then you start to hone in on your specific question that you're looking at in your paper. So let's say that I am looking at caffeine consumption and its effect on sports performance. I would maybe start off talking about how caffeine is the most widely used drug in the world. I might then start talking about how it has benefits for sport performance. And then I might funnel down even further and talk about how we don't know whether these benefits maybe differ among gender. You do need to have a thesis statement or essentially a purpose statement. This is the question that you're going to answer in your literature review. So your thesis statement, your purpose statement, it should go at the end of the introduction, kind of wrapping up your summary of the topic and identifying very clearly what you are going to examine in your paper. After your introduction, you're going to want to think about the main themes you're going to cover in your paper. So this is really like the body of your paper. This is where you're going to talk about the 10 articles that you've identified and summarized in that abstraction table. So you're going to want to have more than one theme. You'll need to identify the themes of your paper. And under those themes, you will probably have sub-themes as well in terms of how you organize that paper. And so the first theme, you'll provide an overview of your first theme, discuss the way it emerges in your chosen field, and discuss relevant text as reference. And so thinking about that, you might have sub-themes that you're going to break your studies down into to make them more comprehensible and easy to understand in terms of flow. So your sub-themes are going to be the way essentially that you organize those papers under some main central theme. So let's say, for example, the first theme is the effect of exercise interventions on glucose levels. So that's my main first theme. My sub-theme is maybe studies showing exercise interventions don't work. And then another sub-theme could be studies that show that they do work. So maybe there's conflicting evidence on that specific area. So you could organize it like that. There's also other ways to organize it as well, but you'll want to think about your themes and your sub-themes and how that makes sense in terms of your research topic. There really is no right or wrong way. It just really depends on what you're looking at. You should have at least 2 themes. It's possible you might need 3, but typically students for this literature review assignment have about 2. So remember, you have your introduction, you've got your the main body of your paper where you've got those themes and you're talking about those different sub-themes and you're citing those different papers, at least 10. You're going to finish with your conclusion section. You want this to be at least a few paragraphs long, and you want to wrap up your discussion and think about the strengths and the weaknesses of the literature and the text you chose to examine. So I would start off for my outline. I would have a bullet point that maybe talks about kind of the overall key findings of all the literature that I have reviewed. I would also then have some bullet points that talk about the limitations as well as the strengths of overall of all the papers that I reviewed. And then also I would have a section that talks about ideas for future research. So think about the study designs, think about the sampling techniques, think about maybe the ways that the variables were measured, and think about how we could get better at conducting those research studies. So you don't have to, again, you should not be writing this out in paragraph form at this point for your outline. It should be bullet points, but I do want you to kind of think about this instead of just having placeholders. The more work you do now, the easier it's going to be when you go to actually write that paper.